Welcome back, everyone. We are discussing pursuing more equitable grading practices and providing better feedback to learners. In the first segment of this webinar, I discussed some different considerations that we might make as we begin the process of pursuing more equitable grading practices. Part of that conversation touched upon the distinction between learning outcomes and learning targets. All of us are familiar with course level outcomes, and we're aware of the fact that those are typically the things that students will know and be able to do by the time they've finished a course. They're often the work of an entire semester. Module level learning outcomes are the work of an entire learning module, and they align to those course level outcomes. Both of these kinds of outcomes are constructed for instructors' use primarily and shared with learners who may or may not struggle to understand them, because most of the time these outcomes employ highly academic or technical language that's difficult for some to understand. Learning targets are a different thing. Learning targets are constructed for learners first. They use learner-friendly language and they're small. The thing about course level outcomes and module level outcomes is that they're huge. They're the work of several different lessons typically, and several different multiple passes through the learning experience. A learning target is a micro bit of a course level learning outcome or a module level learning outcome. They're taught and assessed in a single lesson. And I can demonstrate this for you right here. Here you'll see a course level outcome for a course that I'll be teaching soon, sociolinguistics. When you take a peek at this outcome, you'll see that course level outcome number 1 challenges students to identify and define languages, dialects, and varieties. This is very complex work. It's going to require me to teach it slowly over time. So I have to sort of unwrap that outcome and break it into smaller learning chunks and opportunities. This is where my module outcomes become valuable. Module outcome number 1, I will help students identify and define languages. And in that same module, but perhaps another chunk or learning opportunity, they'll identify and define dialects. And finally, they'll identify and define language varieties, vocabulary, sounds, grammatical constructions, styles, and dialects and languages. You can see by looking even at the module outcomes, these are still really big. Learning targets help us break robust outcomes into much smaller, teachable, and accessible targets that students can hit in one brief moment in time. Here you'll see that I've taken my module outcome number 1A and broken it down into even smaller targets. In my first lesson, students will identify languages. In my second lesson, they'll define them. In my third lesson, students will identify dialects. And in my fourth, they'll define them. In my fifth lesson, they'll identify the varieties that are influenced by vocabulary, sound, and dialect. And in my sixth lesson, we'll focus on grammatical construction, style, and language varieties. Target 7 will give them the opportunity to practice defining those varieties in a more synthesized way. In the next module, we'll talk more about what it looks like to work with learning targets in a meaningful way and how this might influence grading in those practices.